Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another Haunting Hour episode review. This episode comes from Season 1. It was written by Melody Fox and directed by Neil Fernley, and the episode in question is Alien Candy. Now, Alien Candy was an episode that I remember catching, around the early stages of me getting into the Haunting Hour show, which I've shared before, was around the late portion of season 1 and around the beginning of season 2 was when I really discovered the show and started to get heavily into it. This had to be one of the earliest episodes I watched. And knowing nothing about the Haunting Hour short story collection or the Nightmare Hour short story collection, I thought that this episode was the show's way of remaking a famous Goosebumps story that I got to experience when I was in middle school called Calling All Creeps. Come to find out, years later, that Alien Candy was one of the few adaptations in the Haunting Hour of a short story that was featured in, I think, the Nightmare Hour, which was the first book of 2 that I just mentioned, the Nightmare Hour and Haunting Hour. So, while I haven't read the short story at the time of me making this review, I'll probably read it for the Goose Junkies podcast and eventually sit down and finally read the Nightmare Hour and review the short story collection as a whole. I think that this episode, in some ways, redeemed how I felt about Goosebumps' Calling All Creeps adaptation. This is a wild, different direction that Calling All Creeps had laid out in Goosebumps, and this is definitely a known one in the Haunting Hour of being very Goosebumps-esque in nature, not so much the Haunting Hour. But I will say that this episode does hold up surprisingly well. It's not the greatest thing ever. It does have some flaws that I'll mention in the review portion, but yeah, this is a solid Haunting Hour episode, and I can see why this one is still talked about till this day. It might be differing on opinions depending on what crowd you fall into with this show, but I had a fun time watching it for this review. So, yeah, take my recommendation with a grain of salt at the end of the day, but if I had to recommend it to you, I would. So, if you're curious about checking this out and maybe you like Calling All Creeps, look at this episode and see how you feel about it. So, now I'm going to get into the plot overview of the episode. I'm not going to try to give a lot away, but if you don't like some spoilers here and there, click off and come back to the review portion, okay? Or maybe go watch the episode before you decide to sit through this. So anyways, the story is about this 6th grader named Walt. And Walt is played by the actor who starred in Diary of a Wimpy Kid, at least the original first 2 movies, I think. And he played a character, Fregley, in those movies. And it's weird seeing him outside of that franchise, but I think all 3 of the main Diary of a Wimpy Kid cast members from those late 2000s movies were in this show at some point. So it's cool to see him here. And Walt is really into aliens and sci-fi, and he carries around this alien book. And one day he's in his lunchroom talking with his best friend Tim, and Tim is also another kid like him who's also nerdy, and we discover that both of them are being bullied by this jerk named Dwayne. And Dwayne causes a ruckus in the lunchroom and catches the attention of the lunch lady, incidentally, that ruins, I think, chicken nuggets that she's making for the cafeteria. So both the boys get scolded for what had happened, but unbeknownst to Walt, he dropped his alien book. And these 2 older kids named Bonnie and Greg, who I think are described to be siblings or maybe friends in the episode, I can't really remember, but they are observing what's going on and perhaps looking at Walt's interest in aliens. And they decide to pick up his book and hand it to him once he's leaving Dwayne's side, let's just say. And at first, Walt is taken aback by the kindness of the strangers, and he's like, well, thanks. And then we see Bonnie and Greg kind of talking with each other and conversing about possibly initiating Walt into some sort of club of theirs. And then they mention the club to Walt, saying that, hey, we see that you're into aliens, and we want to extend the olive branch to you. We want to be friendly. We have a private club that's not really sanctioned by the school. We have a secret meeting room, and it involves possibly some stuff that you're interested in. So Walt's like, okay, let's go check it out. What can hurt? You know, making friends with older kids that could possibly help my social status, or might be cool to actually have friends that bond with me over this stuff. And when he goes into the room that they have their secret hangout in, Bonnie and Greg reveal that they have this alien technology and confirm, I guess, an in-universe conspiracy theory that Walt knows about. And they confirm to Walt that it's true and that they're actually on an assignment to communicate with aliens. And they actually have this candy, which look like very bright blue jelly beans in the color of a certain substance out there that if you ever watch Breaking Bad, you'll get that reference. But anywho, the two tell Walt that in order to communicate with the aliens, he needs to eat this entire bag of these jelly beans, and that will cleanse whatever he has going on inside of his body to allow him to telepathically communicate. And Walt can finally live his fantasy of being, in contact with aliens. So Walt's ecstatic, and he buys a hook, line, and sinker and takes the bag with him home and starts chowing away on the jelly beans. But when he's at home, his friend Tim comes to visit him, and Tim wants some jelly beans, but Walt doesn't clue him in on what's going on with that. And then after the two have a conversation and Tim leaves, Walt, of course, decides to go to bed. But while he's in bed, he's greeted in the middle of the night in a very weird and almost nightmarish situation where he sees essentially Bonnie and Greg wake him up, and they do something to his body with the alien technology that he saw earlier on that makes him immobile. And he's like in the stasis, and he can't move his body, but he's awake and he sees what's going on. And he watches Bonnie and Greg essentially reveal to him that, plot twist, this happens very early on in the episode, so this is hardly a spoiler, but they're aliens. And we see their true form. And we get a sense that what Walt has been given to eat isn't for communicating with aliens. It's actually to cleanse his body of toxins to make him edible, let's just say. And in a pretty horrific scene, it doesn't go too far with gore or anything, but Walt witnesses an appendage get eaten by one of these aliens. But unfortunately for the aliens, they realize something about Walt, possibly involving his hair color, that registers to them that he's actually not good to eat because they're allergic to a certain hair-colored type of people. Even though in the episode, Walt's actor, the guy who played Fregley, who's a redhead in Diary of a Wimpy Kid, had dyed his hair black for this role. They learned that through a photo or something. So they skedaddle, and Walt seemingly goes back to sleep. And when he wakes up the next morning, he realizes that he's okay and nothing bad has happened to him. So he acts like his day is normal. He heads back to school. And there's a scene where, he's in his gym locker room, I guess, getting prepared. And he pulls off his sock, and he notices that his toe is missing. And he freaks out, and his bully Dwayne is nearby and notices that Walt's also missing a toe. And that, of course, freaks Dwayne out and thinks that Walt's now a freak. And because Walt is cognizant about what he remembers from the night before and what he's witnessing now, Greg and Bonnie nearby are also spying on Walt to make sure that he's not going to whistleblow, and they notice that he could be a liability in what they have going on. And we also learned that possibly Walt's best friend Tim is a better suitable candidate for them to consume, let's just say. So Walt has this kind of frightening interaction with Bonnie, and then of course this culminates in him having another altercation with another character. And then he notices that his friend Tim is missing and puts two and two together that Bonnie and Greg must have gotten it to him. So he goes to the secret room, I think after school hours, to save his friend Tim, who has been, put into stasis in this room, I guess, in the building. And Walt comes in desperately trying to rescue his friend, and I think with a weapon. It could be like a fire axe or something, and he hits the light, and the aliens get, confused by the fumes of the light being broken, and the two head off to the lunchroom to hide out. And this is where the climax of the entire episode takes place, where the aliens have essentially come to, deal with Walt and Tim, who have now become both liabilities in their plan. And we ultimately get to see what happens with the two characters. And they come to a conclusion involving a certain substance that's in the cafeteria and Ready Supply that can possibly put a stop to their whole ordeal and stop Bonnie and Greg once and for all. But there's something that happens to Bonnie and Greg that maybe impacts something in the cafeteria, and that plays a role at the end of the episode, where they see the horrifying realization of what's happened to them, let's just say. So that, in a nutshell, is what you're going to expect out of Alien Candy here. I'm going to say this up front. I thought that this episode was that perfect balance of humor and horror. It didn't always maintain just being kind of like a farce of the idea of calling all creeps, and that admittedly is part of the charm that I think really helps this episode. And I think, quite honestly, and I'm being real when I say this episode here, at least, has arguably scarier and more tense scenes than Calling All Creeps ever had. And that's saying a lot. But yeah, the toe eating scene was great. And the climax to this episode is quite fun. I think that people, historically, when they talk about The Haunting Hour, they kind of undersell this episode, I feel, with how just bonkers it is. And for it being kind of like a reimagining on the idea of Calling All Creeps, which isn't necessarily doing the angle they're doing here, I guess. I like the change here with the whole aliens eating humans, and I think that really does work and adds tension for how young of a character Walt really is. And when you really think about what he's going through in the episode, it's really messed up. Like, the villains of the story have a legitimate threat level. Maybe not against Walt because he has some plot armor, and we'll get into that in the negatives, because that just seems random for the sake of it, like Haunting Hour traditionally has in the negatives of their episodes and their content. But yeah, this episode was delightfully balanced in terms of horror and humor. I think the acting performances here were solid for the most part. There's no real bad performance here. I think the guy who played Greg looked eerily familiar, and then when I watched my friend the Horrorlander's review on Alien Candy, he mentioned that the guy was in My Babysitter's a Vampire, and then it clicked. I'm like, okay, that's where I know him from. So seeing some familiar faces on top of just Walt's actor was really cool. And there's something about this episode that really registers with me in terms of the story. While it's kind of basic in how it lays out what Walt and Tim are going through, and their friendship isn't fleshed out whatsoever, so them being friends kind of feels like the afterthought of this story, even though it plays a pivotal role near the climax of it. What I think this episode really does deliver on is moral messages and some good messages for kids to understand, and that is trusting strangers. And it's almost kind of a play on, you don't take candy from strange dudes in vans. Here you have unsuspecting high schoolers trying to befriend a sixth grader, and the sixth grader is so young and impressionable, he doesn't really think that there could be a wolf in sheep's clothing right in front of him like that. But I think the story really does execute that message in a fun and creative way. And using that Calling All Creeps approach, where there's aliens trying to take over a school, which is basically just the faculty, even though the faculty came after Calling All Creeps. I digress, but they all play on the similar idea, right? And I think it does work for that, and I think it actually does execute that idea a bit better than Calling All Creeps did, which is a plus to this episode here. And people love to bash how basic the alien designs look here, but I think what sets this off, they're typical looking gray-skinned aliens. You've seen this stuff before. As a matter of fact, I pointed this out, and I think it's kind of funny to mention this. If you've ever seen Scary Movie 3, and you know the aliens that do the thing with the finger, these aliens look just like them. But I like the teeth here, and I like I said, they have a threat level to them, and there are some good shots, especially in the climax of these things, that look kind of terrifying. And I'm not gonna lie, even though they look like generic green skin aliens, and I've become kind of desensitized to how they look in terms of like it being scary. But if I saw that in a dark cafeteria with poor lighting, I might crap myself. So, yeah, kudos to them for making, the villains pop in that way. And yeah, I mean, I have a lot of positive with it. It has a great pace to it. It's short and sweet. It flies by. This episode is not a slog whatsoever. This is an easily rewatchable episode. And yeah, it's good for what it is in a lot of areas. Now, what I think kind of holds it back from being great, right, is, now we're getting to negatives, right? The simplicity of the story. There's not a lot to it, and while that could be a good thing, sometimes a blessing, it's also a curse, especially when we're talking about a show that's known for producing more original content than adaptation content. Like I said, I'm assuming that the short story that Alien Candy is probably 10 or less pages, if that. So I'm assuming that they actually added on to the concept quite a bit here, but it could have been more expansive with a higher budget, and I do see the potential there. Kind of like in Calling All Creeps, of doing a follow-up episode and building on to what happens at the end. I just kind of wish that there was more to the story here, but for what it is, it does work in that low-budget haunting hour kind of way. This is one of the episodes that take place primarily in the school. And I think for the most part, they reused the same school in the haunting hour. Like I said, for the most part, I can remember a handful of episodes that I think had a different looking school here and there. But, I digress. I just kind of wish there was more to it. It's not the biggest negative ever, but it's there. And looking at the plot, right, I already brought up this, so I guess I'll mention it here. There's some plot convenience going on here, or random WTF plot points, like the whole redhead thing being there for humor in terms of Walt's character having plot immunity so he can survive and save his friend. That's so forced. But, I will say they don't overstep that rule, and it seems like that's the only blanket rule of these aliens and how they go about eating humans. They just flat out say, hey, we're allergic to redheads. I get that. But it's so forced just to keep Walt in the story that it kind of hurts. And while it's not the worst thing ever, it's not quite killer mustard gas from Mascot level weird, but it's here. And I'm going to say this, going back to the characters and buying these characters and their situation they're in, I totally get that Walt and Tim are nerdy. I totally get that they have a bully Dwayne. But even then, we don't spend enough time kind of building up these situations to really understand Walt's perspective of him being kind of like an outcast. You only really get to see that within like the first 2 or 3 minutes. And while it's serviceable, I kind of wish the story spent more time building up Walt and Tim's friendship for being outcasts. And I think that possibly could have helped more symmetry with the story and why they appeal to want to join Bonnie and Greg, who are obviously older than them. And that could have possibly played a bigger hand in taking candy from strangers in that moral lesson a bit better. And I think the writing could have been a bit stronger in those areas. And if it was, I think that this one probably could have been in contention for like one of the like great haunting hour episodes. And I still think that this episode is very good for what it is. But like I said, there are some things about it that just kind of hold it back. And I think those 3 are the biggest prominent ones. So take that for what you will. So without much else to say about Alien Candy, if I had to rate this episode from a 0 to 5 star basis, I want to say that this is like an A tier, but I can't quite put myself there with it because I do think that episodes like Mascot are better, and I gave that episode a 4.3 given all of its annoying problems. This one doesn't have too many annoying ones. It's just kind of milquetoast, but like in the good way, So I'm willing to give it a B, but where I settled with it might shock you. I decided for each one of the issues, I deducted between 0.2 to 0.3 apiece, and I decided around maybe like a 4.1 out of 5 stars. It's a B minus, but it's a very good Haunting Hour episode in my opinion. I would come back to this episode. It's pushing me full on loving it. I've never really felt love for this episode from memory, but maybe in a few years, once I'm done, going through the Haunting Hour show and I think back on it, this one I can definitely see when I make my ultimate ranking for the Haunting Hour TV show. This one might get bumped up at some point if I had to predict. But yeah, that's all I have to say about Alien Candy's episode here. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this episode before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? What's your thoughts on it? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.